In a world where ancient warriors' swords are embodied in human form to defend history, they must prevent an army of strange entities called the Temporal Regression Army from altering history. The story begins with a sword named Suza, who dreams of an incident from when he was a sword owned by a warrior named Nobunaga. During a battle, the sword, Suza, was in a burning castle, and the fire consumed him as well. After waking up from the dream, Suza finds his human body intact. At the same time, a battle is taking place between one of the teams of these embodied swords and the Temporal Regression Army, who are trying to change history by assassinating an important Japanese figure named Ieyasu. However, the assassination attempt fails thanks to the swords, who defeat these strange entities with ease, much to the astonishment of Ieyasu's personal guards. While this battle is happening, we shift to the place where all the swords live, showing the details of their daily lives, from eating, drinking, and training to farming and harvesting. An important meeting begins with their master and his direct servant, who is responsible for all the swords and is one of them, named Mikazuki. As all the swords are present, a group is late, namely Team 2, which was protecting Ieyasu. After the routine meeting ends, everyone goes back to their work, some heading to the library, others preparing food, while the rest take a short rest. At this moment, Mikazuki embodies a new sword named Fudo to serve the master, whose goal is to protect history. As soon as this happens and Fudo finds himself in a human body, he is confused until Mikazuki tells him he was summoned to serve in this fortress as a warrior. We then return to Suza, who talks about his dream with one of his companions named Yagen, telling him he has the same dream repeatedly when he was a sword and burned in one of the battles of his last owner, Nobunaga. Yagen replies that he also dreams but not the same one each time, and that these dreams are probably his memories as a sword, replaying because of the emotional impact of what happened back then. After Yagen finishes speaking, he goes to get medicine for Suza to help him sleep deeply. During this time, a group of their companions comes looking for the new warrior, Fudo. Then we head to the training hall, where we see a fight between two of the most skilled swords in the place, Yama and Kashu. Kashu has a slight advantage in the fight over Yama, even managing to pin him against the wall. But Yama manages to escape the trap and even uses it to his advantage by jumping behind Kashu and trying to strike him, but Kashu blocks it. All of this happens while a group of their companions watches. Kashu tries to knock Yama to the ground to end the fight, but Yama regains his balance and quickly stands back up. They then return to direct combat with wooden swords until the wood falls from their hands and the fight ends in a draw. But Kashu still wants to continue fighting Yama and tells him, "Let's go for another round." Their companion, Shoko, steps in, saying it's his turn to fight. To resolve the issue without a fight over who fights whom, their companion, Soro, suggests they hold an open training session for everyone instead of pairing up, since real battles are not always one-on-one. Everyone agrees to this idea. At this point, Suza arrives, and they ask him to join the training. He tells them he can't because he hasn't been sleeping well for a few days and his energy is low. They tell him he needs to fix that because, whether it's a fight or just an ordinary day, everyone's health needs to be in top shape. Their conversation is interrupted by the new sword, Fudo, who enters the hall in a semi-conscious state. None of the swords know who he is, seeing him for the first time. He introduces himself, saying his name is Fudo, and he was the favorite sword of Nobunaga. When they find out that he belonged to Nobunaga, they say he must know Suza. So, Fudo stands up to confirm Suza's identity and takes a good look at him. Even though it's their first time meeting in this form, Fudo manages to recognize Suza and tells him that he hasn't seen him in a long time. Suza honestly replies that he doesn't remember him. Fudo then says that he doesn't remember much of the past either, but he clearly recalls that they were both important swords for Nobunaga. At that moment, the officer Mikazuki arrives and finds that Fudo has already introduced himself to the group. Fudo tells him that he also met an old friend, Suza, as they both belong to the same owner, Nobunaga, who also owns other swords here. Among them is Yagen, who was with Suza earlier. The reason Nobunaga possesses all these swords is that he is one of the most famous sword collectors, always ensuring he has nearly every powerful sword available. Mikazuki changes the subject and says that he was supposed to give Fudo a tour of the fortress, but the Lord had tasked him with something else. So he asks Suza to show Fudo around the place. Mikazuki then leaves immediately, even though Suza seems reluctant. Yama notices this and decides to join Suza in the tour. As the tour begins, Yama tells Fudo that 2,000 years ago, historians started attempting to change history by traveling back in time and altering it by force. As a result, the warrior swords were incarnated by their lord, Saniwa. When they aren't on the battlefield, they remain in the castle, cleaning, training, farming, and doing many other things like ordinary humans to maintain their body's strength and combat fitness. Fudo listens to all this as they walk and asks Yama if this castle ever ends. Yama replies that it's just big enough to house the necessary soldiers for protecting history, and it will likely expand soon because their numbers need to grow. By the end of the tour, Fudo has nearly learned the details of his new home. He tells Suza and Yama that he's a useless sword but will try to do everything he can. When they ask him why he considers himself a useless sword, he says that his previous lord, Nobunaga, cared for and loved him, but he couldn't return the favor. After finishing his explanation, a group of fellow swords arrives, meeting him for the first time. They realize he's the new sword among them. So Fudo introduces himself and says he was owned by Nobunaga. One of them remarks that he must know Hasebe, since he also belonged to Nobunaga. Fudo eagerly goes to Hasebe, hoping they remember each other, but neither recognizes the other. Fudo asks if perhaps they belong to him at different times. Hasebe replies that he doesn't care about Nobunaga anymore, as his current lord is the only one he serves and cares for. As the sun sets and the atmosphere grows calm, with everyone busy, Suza sits alone. Yagen approaches him and sits beside him, saying that he heard the new sword also belonged to Nobunaga, just like them. He adds, "Let's hope it doesn't affect your dreams even more." He explains that their owner, Nobunaga, wanted to monopolize all the famous swords, as if he wanted to keep all the world's power for himself. At this time, Yama sits alone, reflecting on Fudo's words about being a useless sword. While deep in thought, one of his fellow swords approaches him and says that their lord is asking for him. Yama goes to meet their lord, with Mikazuki accompanying him in a private room. There, Yama is shocked when their lord assigns him the responsibility of overseeing the swords and becoming his direct servant, replacing Mikazuki, and he asks why he was chosen specifically. So, Mikazuki tells him that their leader believes he is the right person for the position. Yama says that he's just a copy, so what do they expect from him other than failure if he takes on such a position? Mikazuki replies that being in charge of this place is the most important part of their mission, and there is no room for failure, and as long as their leader chose him, that means he will be up to the responsibility because their leader doesn't just choose randomly. He also tells him that it's not the first time he's been responsible for the place, so it's not a new situation. Yama then says that when he was in charge before, he caused the annihilation of his entire squad, but their leader tells him that he's no longer the same person as before, and this won't happen again. The next day, Fudo immediately starts working with them in the field, planting crops. When he sees a worm for the first time, he has no idea what it is. They tell him that it's a worm that can cause disasters to the crops despite its small size. Fudo is surprised and recalls Suza talking about Nobunaga. Then, Yagen arrives and tells Suza that the new guy seems to be enjoying the atmosphere here, to which Suza responds that they both belong to the same person but are completely different from one another. Later, we move to the kitchen, where Fudo enters for the first time and is shocked by the look and size of the food. Anyway, since he's lost when it comes to cooking and almost everything, one of his colleagues suggests he ask their friend, Sayo, to teach him the basics like peeling and cutting vegetables. Fudo immediately asks Sayo for help. Then comes training time, where almost all the swords, including Yama, gather in the garden. After training, one of the swords tells Yama that he needs to have strong muscles if he wants to work as the one responsible for the place. At that moment, Hasebe arrives and joins them, saying he heard that Yama would be in charge of the place, so he congratulates him and tells him it's a big responsibility. However, Yama interrupts him and says he doesn't deserve the position, and they all probably agree on that. Hasebe tells him that even if they think he doesn't deserve it, those are the leader's orders, and opinions won't change anything. He also tells him that he has to give it his all so as not to disappoint their leader, and he should use this time spent complaining for training instead. Later, during dinner, while they are eating, Fudo goes around asking each person their opinion on the food he made, even though Sayo was the one who did almost everything, and Fudo was just helping. After dinner, they all go to sleep, except for two who meet on the rooftop while watching the moon. During this time, Suza wakes up startled from his sleep after having the same dream again, and he tries to go back to sleep. The next day, while most of the swords are playing with the tiger cubs after breakfast in the garden, and Suza is watching them, Yagen comes over and sits beside him as usual, talking to him about his dream since it's clear he had it again. Suza tells him that he indeed had the same dream again, and now doesn't know if this is a good sign or not. One of their colleagues named Ichi joins them, and when he hears about Suza's dream, he He tells him that the dream is likely connected to his life story when he was a sword, and it must have an important meaning and goal that he needs to discover. Their conversation is interrupted by a small tiger from the group playing nearby, and the others quickly come to apologize and take the tiger away. At that moment, one of the swords named Namazu comes over and tells Ichi that they are ready to head out for the mission, which includes several members, such as Sayo and Yama, and the two swords, Soru and Shoko. So when Fudo sees this group, he gets excited and asks them to take him with them. But Yama tells him that they are heading into a battle to protect history. He explains that they travel through time and space to defend history and protect it from the time recession army, controlled by historians who want to alter history. As for the historians' motive, they don't know what it is, but they defend history because those are the orders of their master, who gave them human form to carry out these commands. Anyway, they set off on their mission, leaving Fudo at the castle. He's sitting there alone during sunset when his colleague, Midari, finds him upset because Yama scolded him, and he didn't go on the mission with them. He tells her that's not why he's upset. He just doesn't understand what it means to defend history. Midari reassures him, saying not to worry, he'll understand everything later. At that moment, the battle to stop the attempt to change history is underway. The time recession creatures appear and try to fight one side of the war so that they lose, which goes against what happened in actual history. The swords stand back during the creatures' attack to observe the situation and figure out how to deal with it. They discover that the recession army is attacking a large, powerful, and very important fortress called Tokaga Castle. They decide that the plan is simply to wipe out this army. But before Echi and Namezu leave, Namezu mentions that the castle has an important connection to their former master. Echi agrees, saying that they used to belong to the Toyoto clan. Namezu then says this is the place where they both burned. And before he can finish his suggestion to save themselves from that fate, Echi interrupts him, saying that if they change history, they'll be no different from the enemy they're fighting. The battle begins, and each group of swords faces off against a group of these creatures. Sayo is in one of the groups with someone named Suki, who gets distracted during the fight, recalling his master who had once been in this same place. While he's lost in thought, one of the creatures attacks him, but Sayo protects him. We then return to the other groups in the castle courtyard, where they've all finished off the strange creatures and are waiting for Sayo and Suki. Suddenly, they see the two of them approaching, with Suki carrying Sayo, who had been injured while defending him. His injury looks serious, so Shoko treats him initially before they head back to their castle. Everyone there is worried about him, but Echi reassures them, saying he'll be okay. Afterward, Echi enters the room where Sayo is resting, surrounded by some of his comrades, including Suki, who blames himself for Sayo's injury. Yama asks him what happened, and he explains that during the battle he remembered his former master, Itabo, who had once been in the same place trying to stop a war through peace negotiations. Suki had hesitated to stain the place with blood after a peace treaty had been made there, and the time recession army took advantage of his hesitation and attacked him. Sayo saved him and took the hit instead. That's why Suki blames himself and wishes that the blow had struck him instead. But Echi doesn't let him blame himself alone and says that, as the leader, it was his fault too. Suki stays up late beside the injured, Soya, with Suza, and the two of them hear Soya muttering in his sleep that he must seek revenge. Suki remarks that he's probably dreaming about something that happened when he was a sword, just like what happens to Suza. He also says that his former master tried to spread peace during a time of constant wars, which is why he shares his master's desire to promote peace. As for Sayo, things are different. His master's mother was killed by bandits when he was young, so he spent years trying to track down his mother's killer to exact revenge, and eventually he found and killed him. That's why Sayo has a thirst for blood and killing. Suza says that regardless of their individual pasts, they all have a duty to defend history. The next day, Yama announces a war meeting which is attended by him, Mikazuki, Soru, Hasebi, and Atsushi. Yama asks Atsushi, who led the last mission, to give a detailed report of what happened. He does, but Hasebi tells him it doesn't make sense that someone from their side would get injured in a battle against such a weak enemy and that they should have easily defeated them. Soru replies that the enemy might be getting stronger just as they are getting stronger. Yama says they need to investigate the enemy's strength to understand what's happening and figure out how to deal with it. While explaining the investigation plan, which involves sending expeditions across different time periods, Shuko interrupts, arriving late to the meeting. He apologizes, saying the way from his room to the meeting room was difficult, and he brought them some snacks so so they wouldn't be upset. They all start eating the snacks Shuko brought, forgetting about the meeting entirely. But Hasebi scolds them, saying, "What is this childish behavior? We're talking about war, and you're sitting here eating." Mikazuki tells him to lighten up and relax a bit, offering him some snacks too. Frustrated, Hasebi gets up and leaves the room. As soon as he opens the door, he finds Fudo, who had been eavesdropping on the meeting. Fudo casually enters the meeting room and tells them, "If you're going on a mission, I'm coming with you guys. Maybe I'll meet Nobunaga again." Naturally, they are surprised by his words and seem hesitant, but they try to understand what he plans to do if he sees Nobunaga again. He explains that Nobunaga treated him well, but he couldn't protect him in his final moments, so now he wants to protect him this time. This enrages Hasebi, who tells him, "You don't understand why we're here. We protect history so that it doesn't change, and you're going to change it with your own hands?" Fudo responds, "Why do we have to protect history at all? Why did Sayo get injured in the battle? I won't understand any of this until I meet Nobunaga." After Nobunaga's death, Fudo became a servant to an enemy of Nobunaga, so he wants to know what his feelings will be when he faces the history of both men. Until he understands these feelings, he won't be able to live or fight with them. Hasebi then turns to Yama and tells him to do his job as the man in charge of the swords and teach the new kid what it means to be a sword serving this place. Afterward, Hasebi leaves the room. Fudo runs after him, trying to understand his behavior, especially since Hasebi was also once a servant of Nobunaga. Later, we see Fudo sitting alone, and Yama joins him. Yama tells him that even if he meets Nobunaga, he won't be able to save him because it's a part of history. Fudo asks, "Why do we have to preserve this history?" At that moment, Mikazuki enters and says the reason might be that we are merely tools. We simply do what we are required to do and nothing more. Protecting history is our master's desire above all else, and we can't ask more than that. Or rather, the question won't make a difference. Then, Fudo asks, what will happen if he refuses to follow the orders of their lord, who protects history? Mikazuki draws his sword and tells him that if he does that, it would be their duty to kill him, because those who don't do the required work are eliminated. But their lord doesn't want that to happen to any of them, so why don't we just follow the orders? The next day, Suza is training with Hasebi, and during the training, Hasebi seems distracted and not at his best, but insists on continuing the training. Suddenly, during the training, he recalls Fudo's frequent talk about Nobunaga, their former lord, which enrages him so much that he shouts and curses Nobunaga. Then he stops training, leaves the place, and goes to sit alone, remembering when he was given a sword by Nobunaga as a gift to someone who helped him in one of his wars, named Akechi, after Akechi becomes a ruler. Another war takes place in which Akechi is allied with Nobunaga. Suddenly, a messenger arrives with news of Nobunaga's murder by one of his rebellious followers. At that moment, Fudo is sitting telling stories about his time with Nobunaga to a group of his colleagues who aren't really interested in what he's saying and are feeling bored, wanting him to stop. Nevertheless, he recites a poem written by his lord, Nobunaga, mentioning him to boast about him. But one of the group members gets fed up and says he's going to leave. Fudo doesn't care and continues, telling them that Nobunaga gave him as a gift to his closest advisor. At that moment, Hasebi arrives and sees Sayo standing with them, so he asks him if his health allows him to be there. Sayo responds, saying his health has improved. Fudo then tells Hasebi, "You seem like a good man, so why are you always so harsh?" What upsets Hasebi isn't that he called him harsh, but that he addressed him by the name given to him by Nobunaga. Hasebi then tells Fudo not to use that name again because it's linked to his former lord. As soon as Fudo hears the word former lord, he begins talking about Nobunaga again, which enrages Hasebi greatly. Namazu tries to lighten the mood by saying that Hasebi now belongs to another lord after Nobunaga, so there's no need for this talk. But his words only escalate the situation further. Hasebi says they should forget the past. It doesn't matter who their former lord was. What matters is their current lord. Fudo responds, saying, "It seems you're the one who can't forget the past. And just because Nobunaga is no longer our lord, it doesn't mean we should act like we never knew him." Hasebi then insults Nobunaga, after reaching his breaking point from hearing his name so much, which enrages Fudo to the point that he grabs Hasebi. At this moment, Suza arrives and sees what's happening. Fudo tells him that Hasebi insulted Nobunaga. Hasebi responds by saying that Nobunaga was a weak and failed man who couldn't achieve what he aspired to and didn't deserve to be the greatest unifier. At this point, the tension between the two escalates even more, and everyone tries to calm things down, except for Souza, who seems deeply affected and starts to cry. He runs away from the place, and Fudo chases after him to apologize. At that moment, Yama arrives and asks what happened. Hasebe says it's not worth talking about and walks away. Anyway, we then go to Souza, who is washing his face, and Fudo arrives with Sayo to make sure he's okay and to apologize to him. Souza tells him that there's no need to apologize because it's not his fault, and that the problem is his own, and no one else is to blame. At that moment, Suk enters and asks everyone present to help clean and organize the horse stable. Meanwhile, Yagen is sitting alone with Hasebe and tells him that he hasn't been himself lately and hasn't been acting normally ever since Fudo was embodied. He says he understands how he feels because he was once owned by Nobunaga, and everything Fudo says or does reminds him of Nobunaga, even if he doesn't like it. Anyway, we go to a group of swords who are talking about the issue between Fudo, Hasebe, and Souza, and their relationship with their owner, Nobunaga. Ichi says that Nobunaga was one of the greatest warriors of his time, and many people loved him. But the nature of conflict always causes swords to move from one owner to another, especially when the owner dies. However, the situation is a bit different with a sword like Souza, which has Nobunaga's name engraved on it. Anyway, they start thinking together about how they can find a solution so that the problems between the three of them don't escalate and affect their ability to complete missions. At that time, Souza is cleaning the stable and tells himself that he's trapped like that horse because of Nobunaga's name engraved on him. Suke comes and tells him he's done, so Souza replies that he's just finished as well. Suke suggests they take the horses out for a walk in the forest since they haven't been out for a while. At the same time, a group of swords, including Yama, are training by lifting weights. After the training, they sit together at sunset, and Yama doesn't seem well, though he denies it. But they can guess that it has something to do with the issue of Nobunaga's swords, and they ask him for details about what happened. He tells them that Hasebe and Fudo fought because of Nobunaga, and he starts blaming himself as the person responsible for the place, saying that something like that shouldn't have happened if he had been doing his job well. They tell him that he's not to blame, and that he's doing his job just fine, so there's no need for him to take all the responsibility on himself. But he insists, saying that there are people better suited for the position than him, and that their master shouldn't have chosen him because he doesn't know how to manage the place properly. Yama also remembers when he was responsible the last time, and his entire squad almost died in battle because of his wrong decisions, and he continues to blame himself for what happened back then. Even after he resigned from his position, their master reinstated him to the same position, which affected him. But one of them gets up and tells him that everyone who was with him in that battle is still here and healthy, so there's no reason for all the guilt and self-blame. Everyone agrees with him and says they will always support the leader their master chose. Then, Mikazuki comes and tells him that he has to accept reality. He also reminds him of what their master said when he told him that he's no longer the same sword that was involved in that incident, which is why he brought him back to the position. Mikazuki tells him that all his work from now on should focus on proving that their master's decision wasn't wrong when he chose him. Yama agrees and changes the subject right away to their main issue now, which is Nobunaga's swords. He asks them if anyone has a solution. At that moment, Echi, Soro, and the rest of the group, who were looking for a solution earlier, arrive to inform them that they have finally found one. Meanwhile, Souza and Suki are on the beach with their horses watching the sunset to improve their mood a little. The next day, all the swords in the castle gather in the main training hall. Not knowing the reason, Mikazuki finally arrives with Yama to explain what's happening. Yama tells them that they will be having a combat training session in this place. They are surprised that they will be fighting among such a large group, but Yama tells them that they won't be doing individual duels in the arena. Instead, they will be doing something different and new after their master's approval, a free-for-all battle in an open space, as if it were a real battle, with 4 teams against each other. However, they still don't understand this system, so they ask if it's different from the usual fights they're used to. Yama tells them it is indeed different because they're used to one-on-one duels, but this time there will be 4 teams, each with 6 members. The way to win is by forcing the opponent to surrender or rendering them unable to move. After hearing this, Hasebe says it's a great idea, but asks the commander why they don't request a nearby fort to do such training with them instead. Yama replies that this wouldn't serve their primary goal, which is for each person to get to know themselves and their teammates better and to improve their relationships. The teams are announced, and the first team consists of Yama, Soro, Yagen, Souza, Suza, Fudo, and Hasebe. Of course, this team composition shocks everyone, especially Hasebe himself, who seems to have objections but says nothing. Next comes the second team, made up of Mikazuki, Namazo, Suki, Sayo, Shuko, and Echi. As for the third team, it includes the Sword, Kasen, Honiba, Yamabo, Horuka, Kasho, and Doda. Hasebe objects to his team composition, saying he won't be able to fight with such a team. Yama tells him that the teams were chosen by lottery and were personally approved by their master. At this point, Mikazuki intervenes and asks if he has any objections to their master's orders. The training is set for tomorrow at noon, and everyone goes their separate ways afterward. The next day, a stage is set up in the castle garden for the spectators to watch the training. Commentating on the training is the sword, Midari. Not only that, but there are also two swords providing analytical commentary, Ishiki and Nikure. As for the live broadcast, it's handled by creatures called Konosuke, scattered throughout the forest where the training will take place, with one stationed at the stage. The training finally begins, and they see Yama explaining the rules for the last time. He tells them that the winning team will be the one with the most members who haven't surrendered or lost the ability to move, and the training will last until sunset. Moments before the start, Hasebe tells Fudo not to let the team lose. They split up and the fighting begins. Anyone who sees someone not on their team fights them. Two fighters are incredibly fast, facing off against each other directly. At the same time, it's Yagen and one of his teammates versus two others from a different team who both have aggressive fighting styles. However, Yagen's style is defensive and his partner's style is offensive, so they complement each other in battle. During this time, Shoko is fighting against one of the unknown swordsmen, who is incredibly strong enough to cut down a tree with a single strike, to the point where Shoko can't even land a blow. He's just defending against her attacks. Then, another person from a different team joins her, and they team up against Shoko, who tries to take them both on by himself. His power is immense, but even with that strength, it's difficult for him to defeat both alone. Meanwhile, there are several intense battles happening in different parts of the forest, by the rivers, on the trees, on rocky cliffs, and many other places. Due to all the pressure, poor Konosuke, who's been streaming the whole event, faints, and the stream shuts down completely. But the training isn't over yet. We see Yama walking peacefully through the forest when suddenly Mikazuki appears and attacks him. Mikazuki says he's following the training rules and is taking this seriously because he's thrilled to finally engage in direct combat, especially against Yama. Of course, Yama is still trying to comprehend what Mikazuki is saying, because the main goal of this training was supposed to be solving the Nobunaga group's problem, not actual training. Meanwhile, Sayo is facing off against Soru and asks him if he has any desire for revenge. Soru replies that ever since he got this new body, he's had the desire to do many things he couldn't do before. After this brief exchange, they continue fighting normally, but just as Soru is about to strike Sayo, Suki steps in to block the attack and protect him. Even though Suki hates fighting and prefers peace, he still supports Sayo. At the same time, Suza encounters Hasebe, who feels a bit embarrassed upon seeing him and apologizes for what happened. Suza tells him that he wants to ask how he truly sees Nobunaga and the reason behind his view. Surprisingly, Hasebe doesn't react angrily to the question. In fact, he doesn't have time to react at all because Ichi suddenly attacks them, warning them to stay alert because this isn't a game. Ichi then continues his assault on Suza. Hasebe tries to protect Suza, but Shoko stops him. Two others join in, siding against Hasebe and Suza, because their goal is to get the two of them to team up and fight together. That's exactly what happens. Suza starts relying on Hasebe, who fights against two people with all his strength. As the number of fighters increases, they decide to reorganize the teams into a 3 versus 4 matchup. We then switch to Mikazuki and Yama. Yama asks why Mikazuki is attacking him so seriously. Mikazuki responds, "If you want to achieve the real goal of this exercise and fix the relationship between Nobunaga's swordsmen, you'll have to beat me first, and then you can do that." Suddenly, two others appear during their fight and suggest forming two teams of 2 versus 2. Mikazuki decides to join forces with Yama, since the two newcomers are extremely powerful. At the same time, Fudo suddenly intervenes in the battle between Hasebe and Suza, attempting to do anything, or hits anyone, and when he can't, he decides to provoke Hasebe and starts talking about Nobunaga again, saying how great he was and that everyone should acknowledge that. Hasebe gets really mad, and they grab each other. Suddenly, Suza loses consciousness and collapses among those around him because of the whole Nobunaga issue. Evening comes, and the plan has failed, maybe even backfired, after what happened between Hasebe and Fudo, and what happened to Suza because of them. During that time, Yagen, Sayo, and Suki are with Suza, who is still unconscious. Yagen tells Sayo that he will be fine but needs some rest. Yama overhears this before he opens the door to enter but decides not to. Later that night, Yama sits alone under the moonlight and suddenly, Mikazuki joins him. Yama decides to open up and vent his feelings, saying that he thought the training would improve their relationship and solve the problems, but in the end, their emotions got the better of them. He also says that these emotions are the worst thing we gain as humans, the thing most capable of destroying us and making us do things we could never imagine. Mikazuki responds by saying that we have emotions because we reflect the emotions that humans feel toward us. Like the moon in the sky, people see it as beautiful, and so it feels beautiful. If it were to be personified, it would surely be beautiful as well, but it is not necessarily that beautiful in reality. It's just a rock. When Yama asks Mikazuki what he should do as a servant responsible for the place in such circumstances, Mikazuki tells him he should be like the sun that rises over the fortress, making it look better and improving the relationships of those within it. Yama thinks to himself, okay, but what should I actually do? Mikazuki replies, do the right thing. The next morning, orders come from the lord of the fortress for a group of swords to head into a specific battle to protect history as usual. The group consists of Hasebe, Fudo, Yagen, and Suza, all under Yama's command. The battle takes place during the Hanoji incident, where Nobunaga was killed. He was on the verge of uniting the country and achieving his goal, but in the end, he was betrayed and killed by his servant, Akechi. What will be the reaction of all the swords that Nobunaga once owned if they encounter him? How will they behave on this mission? And will they be able to protect history and let him die as he did, or will they change it? All of this and more we will find out in the next episode, God willing.